Well, you can take a look at any time and find right out. We've got a depth meter right here.
If you want more,
And you're in a perfect seat for it, too. Ahoy, mateys! Ahoy! Ahoy! Again, my name is Grant, and I'll be your boatmate today. I am your first mate. I am your last mate. I'm the only mate you've got. So I guess you could call me your soulmate. Our captain today is Captain Dave, and he is joining us from the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we're going to see if he'll freeze midway through the cruise. Can I have a volunteer to take over if that does happen? Okay, excellent. Thank you, sir. We're going to be making our way down the Connecticut River. It's an hour-and-a-half cruise in total, 45 minutes on the way down to Turner's Falls, and then right back up. So don't worry about switching sides of the boat. You're going to see both sides of the river. I'm going to be talking for the first half of all of this. And then for the second half, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to kick back and look at the river, if you want to try to guess exactly why that squirrel is swimming across the river, that's your time to do it. If you do notice something, point it out. I can't see most of the river from here, so if you see otters or beavers or deer or humans doing strange things or the bald eagles or osprey, we have a lot of species on the river, and I want you to point them out so we can make sure to slow down, pull around, and make sure that everyone can see exactly what's going on. So I appreciate your help on that. But before we launch into the historical and environmental interpretation of the river, I want to make you aware of some of the safety features on board. Above you, you might have noticed these sleek fashion pieces. These are life preservers. On the left side, these are adult-sized. On the right side, these are child-sized. Underneath your seats in the rear, you will find additional ones in those big old tubs. We have 4 exits on board in the front, rear, and on either side of the boat. In the case of an emergency, I'll come to the front and I'll tell you all exactly what we're going to do in the case of each sort of emergency. But here's a hint, really, no matter what happens, we're going to head to shore and get off the boat. Does that sound okay? All right. This is a no smoking vessel. That includes no vaping. Appreciate your compliance with those rules. And if you have other sorts of emergencies, there is a head in the back. We're on a boat, so I just recommend that everyone, no matter what your usual position is, take a seat. You have to press the button for about 4 or 5 seconds before the water comes out. The head does work, but if you do have trouble with it, just let me know, and I'll make sure to give you a little hand with that. Do you have any questions about the safety procedures on board? Excellent. Thank you all so much for coming. So one of the ways that I got into the history of this river, started to dig my fingers into really what the story was here, was by looking at place names. I think if we look at the way that humans have called a place, the name that they've given to it, we can start to understand the relationship that they have with it. It could be an economic relationship, it could be, a historical one, it could be named after a person or a plant, but it speaks to that relationship. And so it's sort of funny that we can call a place by a name our entire lives without ever questioning what that name means. So, Connecticut. First question of the day for you all. Which came first, the state of Connecticut or the Connecticut River? Raise your hand if you think that the state of Connecticut came first. We're a really small precinct, so everyone's got to vote. Anyone for state? All right, who's for river? Wow, unanimous. We got a couple abstaining up here. Oh, okay, whew, that was a close call. Connecticut actually means river. So yes, it did come first. It means long tidal river. It comes from the older Algonquian word Kwinitekw, or Kwinitekw, or Kwinitekw. All these names point back towards the central meaning that describes the river. It tells us things about it. So just by saying Connecticut, we know things about it. We know that this is the longest river in all of the Northeast. It's 410 miles long, stretching from the headwaters at the Connecticut Lakes up at the Canadian border, and then making its way down as the border between states and counties and townships, and then dumping the sewage of New England upon our lovely neighbors to the south, those New Yorkers in the Long Island Sound. New Yorkers will eat anything. The second part of the name, tidal, talks about the mouth of the river. So even without being, when we say the name Connecticut, we know that there's a long tidal zone. You can feel the pull and push of the moon upon the water all the way up in Hartford, actually. In this long estuary, a mixture of salt and fresh water, it makes for a certain ecosystem, a certain sort of fishing on the river. Has anyone on board ever tried eating or fishing for striped bass, stripers? Yeah? So stripers come to the Connecticut River because of that estuary. They spend most of their lives out in the ocean, but they'll come on back to spawn. But then they'll actually continue on up the river, chasing after another migratory species. You ever try going for shad? So shad, blueback herring, sea lamprey, Atlantic salmon, even sturgeon are all migratory species that make their way up the river just between Mother's Day and Father's Day. In 1 month out of the year, we had 300,000 American shad make their way through the Holyoke Fishway. That's a minuscule number compared to the historic counts, which would have been in the millions. A silvery tide rushing up the river. So as you can imagine, this has defined the ecosystems here along the river. It feeds the bald eagles, the osprey, black bears and fisher cat will come to the shores to eat those fish after they go belly up after spawning and drift on over. But they also feed the plants. The beautiful foliage that we see today, part of it is thanks to the fish who deposit phosphorus and nitrogen that they've collected during their life cycle out in the ocean, and they bring back as a gift to the river that they were born in. Up ahead, we got some important landmarks. Anyone know the name of that bridge? French King Bridge. Anyone know the name of that rock that's a little bit closer to us? Sticking its nog, another one. What was that? Deadly. Ooh, yeah, we'll try to avoid it. It might be deadly. Name of the rock, anyone, anyone? French King Rock. So which came first, the rock or the bridge? You're 4 for 4, sir. Excellent job. The rest of you, we're going to need to see the performance stepped up a little bit. Northfield. Northfield. I got you. So the rock came first. And the question that this name begs, French King Rock, is what was a French king doing in New England? It goes back to the French Indian Wars. For an 80-year series of conflict stretching from the late 1600s almost up to the American Revolution. It was a border war, going back and forth, pushing up against one another's frontiers. An extension of European proxy wars, but also having a lot to do with Native American territories in this area. It's sort of a misnomer, because Native peoples were fighting on both sides of the conflict. But this rock, which we're only seeing the top couple feet of, when the French found it, it was sticking out of the water by about 10 feet. The water has risen since. So when they found it, it was quite a landmark on the river. It was right above the rapids below, which have all been drowned by the dam at Turner's Falls. And so when they came across this landmark, the French captain did as any European would do at this time in the New World. They climbed to the top of it, they planted a flag in it, and they smashed a bottle of wine atop, laying claim to it in the name of the French king. And so the name stuck. So the French King Rock marks the entrance to the French King Rapids, and the French King Rapids run through the French King Gorge, and the French King Gorge holds the French King Bridge, which carries the French King Highway down from the French King Motel down to the French King Bowling Alley, which is next to the equally as elegant French King Dunkin' Donuts. So we can learn about history. We can learn about the history of conflict in this area from the name of a bowling alley. Names matter. But names can also cover up other histories, because that French king name covers up the names that the Soquaquik and the Pennacook and the Mohican and the Nipmuc and the Pecumtuck, groups that were represented on that raid on Deerfield as they were making their way down the river. Those names and the stories that accompany them, they've been covered up. They've been pushed to the margins. You don't see them on maps anymore. They're not in the textbooks. Folks just don't think about them on a day-to-day basis. So why is that? Why do some names, why do some stories gain precedence over others? That's one of the central questions for me when I come to this river. Regardless, that strange French king name, it's stuck. And in 1932, this bridge went under construction. 1932. What was going on in 1932? Remember from your youth? So, the Great Depression was on, and this area was especially hard hit. The mill workers and the loggers, the fishermen and the farmers, they were all out of luck. And so the government decided to intervene. This is one of the precursors to the New Deal, providing a lot of employment for a short period of time. They started construction of the French King Bridge in March of 1932, and they finished in September. It only took 6 months to build the entire bridge. And so in September, as the bridge was nearing construction, folks piled into their Model Ts, their horse-drawn wagons. They came from all over New England, from Boston, New York, all over the Berkshires. They came to either side of this bridge, wanting to be the first or the 100th, the 1,000th to cross the bridge on that day. And as the traffic started flowing across, a man walked out to the middle of the bridge and he put on a football helmet and he dove off. He got out of the water, climbed to the top, and dove off again, and he did it 3 times that day, setting the tone for the bridge to be used as a stunt spot, with trapeze artists from touring circuses doing backflips underneath the bridge, with planes from the local airport skimming the water as they fly underneath, with Johnny Weissmuller, the Tarzan from the films, beating his chest as he did a grand rope swing underneath. But the intention of this bridge, to alleviate the economic situation, it actually has the opposite effect. This bridge carries Route 2, the major artery between Boston and the Berkshires, and by moving Route 2 a couple miles north from its original path through Turner's and Miller's Falls, those towns lost the transit economy. The tourists and the truckers didn't stop there anymore. The economic situation grew even worse. You might notice the entrance to the original Route 2 over here. This is the Miller's River. When I say the original Route 2, I mean by that this was the highway connecting central Massachusetts to the Connecticut River Valley. Its extension is the Deerfield River. Running east to west, these rivers provided an intersection between nations. Nations that built themselves around the rivers. Unlike today, where rivers serve as boundaries between economic areas, at that time they were the core. And so to the north, along this stretch of the Connecticut River, were Sokoke homelands. To the south, Pocumtuck. And to the east, along the Miller and other rivers running this direction, were the Nipmuc people, the Mohican to the west. Rivers were highways then. We're on I-91 right now, if that's the old Route 2. And they connected economies. Different livelihoods were able to exchange with one another. The Sokoke specialized in fur and meats, while the Pocumtuck were prolific agriculturalists. The Nipmuc had a lot of specializations, but one of them is revealed in the name of the river itself. What was the Miller's River called before there were mills on it? Names can cover up histories. So I'm going to peel back that top layer that is most recent. The old name of the Miller's River is Papangunquash, which means the river that runs by the butternut trees. So there was intensive silviculture of nut trees all along the Miller's River. That cultivation provided for many other nations in a yearly exchange that circulated food between these nations through the rivers. That continued into the colonial age, with longboats making their way up and down, 16-foot longboats, 4 to 8 feet wide, chugging along this area. They had to build locks. The first dams on this river were not for power, they were for those longboats. Through Turner's Falls, they cut. And that slowdown, and the longboats been hopping off the boat for a little short while to wait for the traffic to clear, caused the rise of the tavern and brothel economy in this area. One of the first riverside economies that we can think about at Turner's Falls. I'm going to send us even further back in time and ask you to take a look at these gorgeous sedimentary cliffs on your right. So these rocks are around 230 million years old. But if you take a look on the flip side, the rocks that are set back on your left, this entire bank is very different actually. It might look the same, but that's just because it's covered in mud. This rock is around 380 million years old, and it's metamorphic rock. This is the bedrock of the continent, formed when Pangea came crashing together. The continents of Africa, Europe, and the Americas pushed together, high heat and pressure, making this bedrock, forming the Appalachian Mountains. But the rock on your right is the marker of the splitting up of that supercontinent. Because as the supercontinent came apart, we didn't just wave goodbye to Africa and they peacefully drifted away. It was a violent affair. The landscape shook, it ripped apart in a lot of places. This could have been the coastline. This was one of the many stress fractures that formed along the continental shelf. Unfortunately, Boston stuck with us and they got the honor of being the coastline. But this area saw such intense seismic activity, like the San Andreas Fault out west. This is the Eastern Border Fault. And along the Eastern Border Fault, this area collapsed by 6 miles. 6 miles downwards. And then the rivers that formed, running east to west, deposited sediment upon that drop. Dinosaurs walked upon it, trapping their tracks in the sedimentary layers that we're cutting through today upon the Connecticut River. The geologic time is sort of mind-boggling to me, so I'm going to try to bring it a little bit more to the present. Does anyone on board remember like 16,000 years ago? So 16,000 years ago, if you'll remember, this area was really cold. We had a glacier here whose height was about 40 French King bridges stacked on top of one another. A lot of ice, a lot of weight, carving out the landscape and then receding. That ice melted and the meltwater had to go somewhere. So on this spot, we had a glacial lake form. So a lot of the hilltops that you see today were islands back then. You'll find round stones atop Mount Tom. Memory lives on. But that glacial lake, it didn't stay. It drained, transforming into a river as the natural dam at its base released. The river carved its way out. Slow down. Carving its way here around the old Miller's River Delta into that glacial lake. At other spots, the river couldn't carve its way around the harder rock, and it had to pool up and go over it, forming a waterfall. And we're actually about to go over a waterfall right now. I know the water looks quite peaceful, but take a look at our depth meter. Right now we're at 30 feet, but we just dropped down to 70, and we're going to keep on going. We're down to 75 feet, 80 feet deep, 90, 95, 100, 106, 119 feet deep. Very nice, Captain. Can you get a big round of applause for Captain for plopping us right over that deep hole? It's 120 feet deep right here. That's the height of the French King Bridge down. And this isn't the drop of the waterfall. This is the plunge pool at its base. As that water fell over the cliff's edge, it churned boulders, drilling into the bedrock in the river. So as we sit on top of that hole, I'm sure you're asking yourself one question and one question only. What's down in it? It's not the Loch Ness Monster. It's not the Connecticut River Serpent. It's not these folks' in-laws. But a UMass professor in the 1980s decided to investigate. He had heard some folklore about this spot, about this strange spot on the river where the water's always cold, where the currents turn strange, where the sturgeon like to hang out. And he decided to investigate. And so he showed up with some scuba gear and a couple graduate students who wanted extra credit on their next test, and they went down into that hole where no sunlight reaches. And they discovered new species of blood-sucking worms, of freshwater sponges, an ecosystem that had never been seen before, just tucked away here on the Connecticut River. And we could have made our way over that hole, and if I hadn't mentioned it, probably wouldn't have noticed. The river holds its secrets really well. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of respect, I think, to earn those secrets from the river. I mean, Professor Klukowski probably would not have wanted to go diving in the Connecticut River 30 years prior. Does anyone remember what the Connecticut River used to be like in the 50s or 60s or even up until the early 70s? It had a nickname, right? America's best landscaped sewer.
Yeah, it's pretty nice now compared to what it used to be.
The color of the river changed on a daily basis, depending on what color paper they were printing upstream. There was a foam on the water. A lot of towns along the Connecticut River, their sewage systems pumped directly in without any sort of treatment. And so this river, you would have to watch out for all sorts of things, not just the Connecticut River serpent. This was not a place that you would want to take a scenic cruise. Down in Turner's Falls, you couldn't even hear the sound of bird song because of the clang of 8-foot hammers pounding out forks and spoons and knives down at Russell Cutlery Factory. We had the largest producer of newspaper print in the nation down in Turner's Falls. This was a hub of industry, and the river suffered because of it. But there were upsides. There was 0% unemployment. Even the children were employed back then. Lots of immigrants arrived at this area for the economic hope that it provided. The industry gave them. And so when we look at the river today, when we smell the river today, when we eat fish out of it or when we swim in it, when we just reflect on how much it's changed, we have to ask ourselves a question, I think. What happened? What shifted? What did happen? This wasn't within my lifetime. What changed between the 70s and now?
They want to change. The government forced them to stop dumping in the river.
Yeah. So we had some regulation come in place, federal regulation, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. And this provided a lot of the federal dollars for towns like Gill to update their sewage system. That would have cost millions of dollars that a small township could not have provided for. The federal government put up that money. But the Clean Water Act was actually a little bit late because a lot of the mills in this area had already closed down. The river had stopped changing color 20 years prior in the 50s. The wave of globalization, a lot of the paper mills in this area had picked up shop and left. That had actually happened 30 years earlier in the 20s down the textile mills in Northampton. They had left because people started unionizing. Labor got too expensive, too unruly. Workers advocating for themselves? Come on. We'll go down to North Carolina, where I'm from, where the regulators don't care so much, where there's quite a bit of labor that will do almost anything for a job. There's a hard story here. I think that we can complicate the environmentalist movement just a little bit, where we're walking a line between economy and environment. Because as the shad and the lamprey and the dragonflies, the kingfishers and the bald eagles, as they started returning to this river, people started leaving. Unemployment skyrocketed. Homelessness was on the rise. The recent opioid epidemic in New England is a result of that economic fallout. And so, how do we engage with that tension? How do we walk the line? Do we just have to choose between economy and environment? Which one do we choose? I mean, when we look back on the economic history of this river, it doesn't provide a very positive outlook. Let's go back 100 years. The first mills arriving on this river. The economic situation was great, but the rivers were poisoned. The dam had just been raised, the canal widened. There was a lot of erosion along the banks here. We can even go back 150 years, back to the logging era. Before the paper mills, there were lumber mills down at Gill. The first lumber mill on the Connecticut River was down in Gill. And the lumber drives made their way down the river, and they had dire environmental consequences. More than just the watershed, the river itself clogged. we had a log jam stretching from the French King Bridge, where we passed under, as far as you can see. 2 miles long. No fishing, no swimming, no sunlight entered the river. For 2 years, that log jam lasted. But it's more than just environmental consequences. There were labor abuse problems during this area. George Van Dyke is kind of the prime example of this. He was one of the mob bosses of the logging industry, and he was known for shouting out a certain saying every time a man fell into the water. Save the PV, not the man. Let the man drown. Grab the equipment off of him. Man's life is worth less than the equipment he carries. And so when his driver put the car into first gear instead of reverse and they went over the cliffs at Turner's Falls, his men shouted out from the water, "Save the PV, not the man!" Certain sort of justice. We can even go back 200 years, and the dam is still here on the Connecticut River with the fur trade and liquor and food making its way up and down the river. Copper sheets and wampum to trade with Native Americans carried on those longboats. Up and down, this river was being used for cargo, and the environment still suffered with the exploitation of beaver and muskrats. We can go back before Europeans arrived and see massive amounts of deforestation with the arrival of corn, beans, and squash. Native peoples burning forests so that the sweet grass would come up, so that the deer would arrive. Easier hunting. So it's a highly manicured landscape. In fact, when we think about the idea of restoration, this river doesn't really allow for us to turn back the clock to some pristine state of what the river used to be. There was no pristine state, because humans have been on this river as long as the river has been here. Along the edges of that receding glacier, as the lake formed, the ancestors of the Kwinitekw people hunted mastodon and elk and moose and giant beavers and squirrel, perhaps about my height. They hunted the megafauna to extinction. But then they shifted livelihoods. With the arrival of this great lake, they moved to a fishing people. And then as that lake drained and the Connecticut River emerged, they shifted livelihoods again, becoming a foraging and fishing people with the migratory fish coming on a yearly basis. Their economy was shaped around these environmental rhythms. And the story of that change, a story that was disregarded by archaeologists for many years, is the story of the great beaver, and it tells this story of environmental change. I'll share it with you today as it was shared with me by the Abenaki storyteller Rich Holsha. He's based out of Wantasket, Brattleboro, as you may know it. It does tell of this tension between economy and environment, restoration and development. But perhaps we don't need to choose. Perhaps there's another way to think about restoration. The story goes like this. Kitsiamisqua was no ordinary beaver. You've seen a beaver, right? Flat tail, buck teeth, waddles around about yay high. Kitsiamisqua is no ordinary beaver. He is a mountain of flesh and fur and muscles stretching so wide and high he can blot out the sun and the moon and the stars all at once. He is no ordinary beaver. And as the largest beaver in all of the Wabanakyak and all of the Dawnlands and all of the Northeast where we are today, the largest beaver looked for the largest river. And so he came here, to the long river, to the longest river, to the Kwinitekw. And there, he made his way along the shore to a place far south of here. And after that long journey, the beaver sat down and looked around. Woo! You know what? This would be a good place to build a dam. And so the next morning, the beaver arose and began to gnaw at the abaziak, at those tall standing ones. There. Tip them over. Drag them into the river and stick them into the mud below the water. The river began to slow until finally it stopped, and below that great dam the water sank until all that was left was a muddy wasteland. But above the dam, a lake had arisen, drowning the homelands of the Woronoko, of the Agawam, of the Nanatak people who left their homelands. They picked up their wigwams, wrapped them carefully in birch bark, and went to the north and to the east and to the west. But by the time the waters crept to the feet of the Pakamtak people, who live just to the north of the Nanatak, they decided amongst themselves, as a people, that they would not leave their homelands. And so a grandmother took her walking stick off the mantelpiece and crept to the south, until before her she saw that great mountain of flesh and fur and muscle. She cried out, "Kitsiamisqua!" But the beaver was napping and did not awake. With snores so loud it shook the earth with every breath, she grew even closer until she began to swim in that lake. She grew even closer, Kitsiamisqua, until she was so close she could touch the beaver's tail, and she took her walking stick and she spanked that beaver. Kitsiamisqua! Put the river back as you found it! At this, the beaver awakes, and quite upset at being awoken so suddenly and so violently, whips around and takes a look at the grandmother. "Why did you awake me? I have much work to do. I must rest. Why did you awake me, little one?" At this point, you may be asking yourself, why, oh why did a grandmother go to speak with this giant beaver? Why didn't a warrior go? Why didn't the sachem, the chief, represent the tribe? Why didn't a medicine man go? Maybe some wisdom, a little magic, knowledge of the land, but no, it was a grandmother. For grandmothers were the decision makers at that time, and they still are to this day. They are the ones who say when the old growth should be cleared from a forest to let the young saplings reach towards the sun. They are the ones who say when new planting fields should be cut, or when the old ones should just be left to rest. They are the matchmakers. They are the choosers of the next sachem. They may become the sachem themselves. They know all of the stories of their people, and so of course it was a grandmother. And she began to share these stories with the beaver in hopes that he might understand exactly what it is he is destroying. But before she can even finish the first story, the beaver begins to laugh at her. A great rumbling laugh. He laughs, and he laughs so hard he slaps his tail upon the water and sends her riding a wave far to the north. She finds herself far from home, in the lands of the Sokoki. If I were the grandmother, I would probably give up at this point. Probably just lay down and cry. But grandmothers are stubborn. They have a certain magic about them where they can take a curse and turn it to a blessing just like that. So she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. For in the lands of the Sokoki lives a shapeshifter. She began to look for Obamak. And there in a cave, she found him. She began to tell the shapeshifter of the beaver. She began to tell the stories of her people, and the shapeshifter listened to every last one of her stories and then went off into the night like a moth. Into the forest Obamak went until the shapeshifter decided that this was not a decision for one being, this was a decision for many. And so the shapeshifter consulted with the Abaziak, those tall standing ones. For they know the sky realm and the underworld and the world in which we live today. They speak in the language of whispers, of rustling leaves and water droplets. Although they remain rooted, they travel through their friends the birds. And in response to the story of the beaver, one of them, an oak, falls to the ground, offering its body. Obomak thanks the tree, and then knows what it is that must be done. Obomak grows to the height of the tallest of all of them, and then twice again, towering above the canopy, the shapeshifter picks up that oak and makes a club of it to do battle with the beaver. The shapeshifter goes to war. And their war is a terrible thing. Mountains are leveled, new valleys are carved, the river is thrown to far-off places, but after 16 moons of battle, the dam is broken. The river begins to flow again. The land returns to the people, and the people return to the land. The Woronoko and the Agawam and the Nanatuk celebrate what the grandmother has done. But Kitsiamisqua? What happened to that great beaver? His neck was broken, cleaved down to the earth by that club in the hands of the shapeshifter. He is no longer a mountain of flesh and fur and muscle. He is a mountain of stone, dreaming the dream of every beaver in all of Wabanakyak. You may have seen him if you have been to the lands of the Pakamtak, and you look to the east. You will see the head of the beaver there, a steep bluff overlooking the southern lands, a place the native peoples call Weequamps, or the English call Mount Sugarloaf. His body stretches to the north, pointing towards the lands from where the beaver came, and to where the native peoples of this valley were forced to go when the second great flood arrived. The flood of English settlement forced the Pakamtak into hiding. It forced them to a great migration. But they carried with them this story. For this is the story of the Misqualawakiak, the people of Beavertail Hill. That is their story, and I thank you for listening. Thank you. Passamaquoddy Chief William shares with us the saying that it is not the stories that are lost, it is the people. We find ourselves today in Squamscott. I'd like to welcome you. You may know it as Turner's Falls. The story of Turner is a tragic one. This is a place of a massacre. Along the shoreline there, 300 were encamped. Refugees from King Philip's War, Metacom's War, the Second Great War of Native American resistance to English colonization. And when the English farmers in Hadley and Northampton and Springfield heard of this gathering, they rallied together, led by Captain Turner, who had recently been released from jail in Boston, Captain Holyoke as well, and they marched up the river, and in the morning, they killed those 300. Captain Turner was killed in a skirmish that followed. There's a plaque to his death. No plaque to the death of the 300. The town is named after him. Holyoke and Amherst. What do we do with these names? What do we do with this history? How do we engage with it in a way that does not ignore and propels us towards something else? Can we? Should we just change the names? Turner is not the whole story. because that moment of violence is just one page in a much larger history. Because this was also Squamscott, and it may be again. Place of gathering, where peoples as far north as Nova Scotia, as far west as Ohio, they gathered here for the yearly fish run. When the shad came charging up the river, they would reach the Great Falls here, and they would be funneled into a 15-foot wide passage. Like 6 lanes of traffic closed down to one, the fish crowded together, were easily netted, pulled out, and smoked all along the banks here, made into fish jerky, which fed many nations for the summer months. As they worked on their farms, they had an easy source of protein in their pockets. This was the rise of agriculture, because the center of that fish, the part that we discard today, was used as fertilizer, tucked into the mounds where they planted their crops. This was not just a place of natural abundance, this was a place of cultural abundance, an exchange between many nations. You learn new languages here, there were marriages had here, many recipes were exchanged, passed between people, all along the shoreline here. Where the Montague Plain was medicinal permaculture maintained by women for thousands of years. And so, when I think about restoration, I don't think about turning back the clock. I think about these layers of names that sometimes feel like contradictory stories, ones of violence and abundance, development and restoration, and I try to learn from all of them. Because I don't think we can just stop the restoration with the shad and the eagles. I think there's a cultural restoration that can happen here. And we need to ask whose voices are valued in the next chapter that we write. Native peoples are still here. Those economies, that idea of sustainability, I think we can learn something from it. As we move forward and we think about the relationship that we want to have with this river, and the tool sets that we have, that's what history can provide. Not guilt, but tools. So I want to thank all of you so much for coming here today, for engaging and reflecting upon that history. We're taking part in that restoration because we all have different knowledge, we all have different expertise and experience, different heritage. And by coming together, by engaging in dialogue, I think that next chapter becomes a bit more hopeful. So thank you all so much for coming here today. If you have questions or comments, or if you want to share your own stories, I would absolutely love to hear them. Thank you all so much. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming again and encourage you, if any of this made you curious, that there's a lot more to be found. These stories are all around us. I mean, for me, a really nice way of doing that was getting into the names. And so I guess I can give you a little bit of homework, if you will. Your homework is this: the name of your town, or if you already know that one, the street that you grew up on, find that name, find the story behind it, whether it's named after a person, or an industry, or a plant. Why? Then come back next year, and if I'm here, tell me that story. If I'm not here, sit down, whoever is the interpreter, and tell them that story. Names can carry history. Sometimes it can be surprising what you'll find. So there's a pattern in the names of towns as we go up the Connecticut River. If you start at Westfield, you can go on up to Hatfield, and then up to Deerfield, and then to Greenfield. And here we are in Northfield. So what are these fields? They're the planting fields. In Westfield of the Woronoko, at Hatfield of the Nonotuck, at Deerfield and Greenfield of the Pecumtuck, and here we are entering the Sokoke homelands. Sounds like a quite English name, but it carries a very different story behind it. It tells a story of how the English found the place, how they saw it when they first encountered it. It tells of prior inhabitants. And so I very much so encourage you, take a look around where you are already. Sometimes the questions and the themes that emerge can have global implications. And if you want to learn more about this area in particular, there's some awesome resources. I always encourage people to go to historic Deerfield and especially check out the Kwinitekw Valley Memorial Association. They're doing a really excellent job of changing that narrative from being one of savages attacking peaceful inhabitants to talking about the larger history of things and where violence happened, different forms of violence. Another great place to learn a little bit more about the economic history is right here at Northfield Mountain. The Visitor Center has a lot on the dams, those longboats making their way up and down, got some of the cider presses, ice cutting, a lot of different stuff to learn. If you want to learn about the ecologies here along the river, those ecosystems are depicted all in dioramas at the Great Falls Discovery Center down in Turner's Falls. There are a lot of different resources. And if you want to learn more about Native American history, I have a resource sheet that I can hand off to you, or I can just email it to you if you don't want to keep track of a piece of paper, and I can help you on your way towards new discoveries. But I want to thank all of you so much for helping me be here today. I would not do this job on an empty boat, so thanks for showing up. And can I get a huge round of applause for our captain, Captain Dave? If you got any more questions, I'm not going anywhere, but we're going to start docking in just a second. Thank you all so much.
Oh, I like their beer. Yeah, it is. Actually,
Do you have a restaurant in this area?
Well, I thought it was eventually talking about.